American forces seized a Shadow Fleet tanker in the North Atlantic, and that is physical proof that sanctions enforcement is no longer just paperwork. Now, a sanctioned ship can be boarded, controlled, and taken. This ship is the named case that every broker, insurer, and captain is now anxiously studying. Vladimir Putin's fatal decision was trying to engage in sanctions evasion with escort and intimidation. Moscow had reflagged the vessel mid-voyage, turning Bella 1 into Russian-flagged Marinera to claim state protection. Moscow deployed a diesel-electric submarine and other naval assets to escort the tanker and signal readiness to defend the cargo by force. However, today, that vessel has been seized. The crew, of Russian nationals included, are facing prosecution in the United States. I'm Dr. Jason Smart, Kremlin Blacklisted for Life, and we are analyzing the structural rot that is collapsing the world's worst dictatorships and totalitarian regimes. If you want the strategic intelligence, the briefings, rather than just the headlines, don't forget to subscribe. So we see how physical interdiction broke the operating assumptions of the Shadow Fleet. Moscow's export workaround stack is under stress, and that stress travels straight into Kremlin decision-making. And Russia really seems to have realized that the game at this point might be over. A second tanker, Sofia, was seized in the Caribbean by the U.S. Coast Guard. Multi-corridor pressure is harder to evade than a single choke point campaign. It forces the Shadow Fleet to price risk across routes rather than shifting risk to just one geography. Moscow's response so far has been mostly just protest and empty threats. Moscow demanded humane treatment for the crew. It demanded their immediate release to Russia. In fact, Russian MP Alexei Zhurlov has called for the sinking of U.S. ships with the use of torpedoes. And when the state's response is this kind of rhetoric, we can be sure that Russia will do absolutely nothing. Russia has shown before that it's usually full of empty words, and this is just one more case of it. But this Shadow Fleet is a very serious thing. In fact, new data from the S&P Global describes the scale in hard numbers. Approximately 1 in 5 oil tankers worldwide is now part of the Shadow Fleet. 50% of these vessels are exclusively dedicated to Russian oil. 20% carry Iranian oil. And UK Defense Secretary John Healey confirmed Marinera is part of this network, which comprises of over 544 sanctioned vessels globally. Now, European policy has been tightening its interdiction activity. In fact, back in December, the Council of the European Union imposed restrictive measures on an additional 41 vessels linked to Russia's Shadow Fleet. Those vessels were added to a list subject to a port access ban and a ban on maritime services. And when lists expand and seizures appear, the operating environment turns riskier, even for ships that are not yet listed. To replace a single 15-year-old Aframax tanker cost about $63 million, and losing just one vessel wipes out the profit from 25 successful evasion voyages. With daily freight rates generating $3 to $4 million per trip, owners are now mathematically better off scrapping their ship for $4 million in Turkey than risking a total loss of over $100 million in the Atlantic. A seized tanker, it creates a zombie phase where legal defense will cost thousands of dollars per hour. It leaves the crew stranded and the assets rotting, proving that Russia's disposable fleet is actually too expensive to lose. Historically, the Shadow Fleet survives by shifting state risk onto private actors. Ship owners, they accept the legal exposure in exchange for high margins. Brokers, they accept reputational exposure in exchange for fees. Crews accept personal exposure in exchange for hazard pay. This system holds when private actors assume enforcement will stay indirect. That'll be slow and mostly symbolic. Nobody will really stop and board the tanker. But today, seizures change incentives very quickly and very unevenly, and that is why the entire system becomes destabilized. The effect is friction everywhere, accumulating in failure. Delays multiply across schedules, and the ports are harder to find. It's harder to find who is willing to give them financing or insurance or even routing. Voyages fail more often through denials, diversions, or aborted transits. The pool of willing intermediaries shrinks as risk becomes personal. And it looks like it's about to get much worse. In fact, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham announced that Donald Trump has agreed to greenlight a bipartisan sanctions bill to punish nations that buy Russia's cheap oil. The legislation explicitly targets China, India, and Brazil, giving the president leverage to cut off the revenue fueling Vladimir Putin's war machine. And we see how the Kremlin has attempted to deter boarding through status, posture, and threats. It re registered the ship under a Russian flag to claim protection and deter enforcement decisions. And it dispatched a submarine to shadow the tanker and intimidate the American enforcement vessels. It issued diplomatic warnings of consequences, and it used political rhetoric to freeze decision making. However, Moscow's submarines were yet again humiliated, and Vladimir Putin's empty words were brushed to the side, as none of those measures stopped the seizure. The boarding happened, the ship was taken. The crew is right now in handcuffs, waiting for their trial in the United States. It seems that Russia now realizes that a submarine nearby does not matter if the state cannot prevent the enforcement action. Venezuela shows what this bridge looks like on the ground. It is now being reported that a Russian general named Oleg Makarovich has reportedly been stuck in Caracas after being sent there following the loss of Kherson in Ukraine when it was liberated a couple years ago. Now, news reports indicate that he has been repeatedly filing requests to Moscow asking that he be allowed to leave as the situation is destabilized there. But it seems that his pleas have fallen on deaf ears in Moscow, and it looks like he'll have a very, very long swim back to St. Petersburg if he wishes to leave. But this is why it's called the protection racket, and this is what it looks like in practice. Moscow demands loyalty. Then it cuts loose anyone who stops being useful. The Shadow Fleet applies the same logic at sea. Private risk for the state's profit. We see that when enforcement turns physical and a corridor becomes dangerous, Moscow does not rescue the assets. It burns them to protect the center. And that's why seizure matters so much. It proves that the racket can no longer guarantee protection. But we've seen a lot of that recently. In fact, look at Vladimir Putin and his friends. We see that Assad in Syria, he's no longer there. Yanukovych in Ukraine, he's no longer there. Maduro in Venezuela, he's no longer there. And the Ayatollah in Iran may soon be hitting the road. It is clear that Russia doesn't have the pretended military force to project the strength necessary. It doesn't have the assets, the cash needed to prop up these regimes. But at the end of the day, it lacks the real political will to save or prop up its allies. Moscow is losing room today to maneuver abroad, and this is all happening as Ukraine is hitting Russia's rear and forcing the redeployment of security assets. And when corridors shrink, the Kremlin shifts from strategy to panic management, and that is when internal control fights accelerate, and that is when mistakes begin to multiply. As all of this is going wrong, Vladimir Putin desperately needs a win, and yet victory at every corner continues to escape him. Following America's Operation Absolute Resolve to arrest Nicolas Maduro, Washington issued an ultimatum to the transitional government in Caracas. The offer is lifting oil sanctions in exchange for complete expulsion of Russian, Chinese, and Iranian interests. This pivot threatens to erase over $17 billion in Russian state loans and investments. Now, Russia is facing a lot of problems because it was not able or willing to help its friends. In fact, look at the exposure that it faces currently. It's about $42 to $60 billion across the failing alliances. That includes $34 billion sunk in Venezuela, $13.4 billion sunk in Syrian debt, $9 billion in Iranian commitments, and $3 billion to the defaulted Yanukovych bond. And while karma is making sure that those loans will never get repaid, Ukraine is making sure that Russia lacks more revenue. Budanov, the former head of Ukrainian military intelligence, is keen to carry out more deep strikes inside of Russia. Budanov is viewed by the Kremlin as a primary threat, and on January 7th, we saw fire engulf the Salyut defense plant in Moscow. Now, this is a critical facility for manufacturing aviation engines for the Russian Air Force. Drones struck Russia's 100th arsenal, Kostroma, causing massive detonations and disrupting ammunition supplies. Attacks were recorded in Samara, Russia, which is an oil hub near Tatarstan, and they also attacked an oil depot in Belgorod. Meanwhile, the Tesh partisans, Russians within Russia, seeking the violent overthrow of the Putin regime, destroyed a key communication tower in Kursk, severing command links between the Russian FSB and military units. And this is all the while that Ukraine is carrying out amazing deep strikes across Russia. And Russia's response? Well, what can it do? Since December 30th, Russian authorities have turned off mobile internet to Kamchatka. Kamchatka is 7,500 kilometers, 4,670 miles from Ukraine's front. But what else can the Russians do? What else can they possibly do to stop the attacks across their territory? But is it really about protecting Kamchatka? Or is it to confuse the local population to believe their government is fighting for their security? To make them believe that something can be done to stop these ongoing attacks? The truth of the matter is, nothing can be done. Ukraine continues to take the war to Russia. Which reminds me, if you want to help in that effort, please do see the first pinned comment below, right below the question of the day, which I hope you'll answer. See how you too can help the Ukrainian soldiers get life-saving drones and other equipment to secure Ukraine's victory over Russia. Thank you. So, what we see today is that maritime workarounds face physical interdiction. We see that rear infrastructure faces persistent pressure. Bureaucracies respond under stress, and stressed bureaucracies make visible mistakes. Vladimir Putin is looking around everywhere for good news, but where he looks, he's not finding it. Look what he sees right now going on in Iran. For 10 days, the protests have continued. Cities like Abdanan, cities like Malakshahai have been taken over by demonstrators. They've driven out the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and forces have there taken over the municipal buildings. We see increasingly these protest forces are also able to torch police stations. They're able to take over government institutions that not so long ago seemed to be secure. Now, aside from losing the shared shadow fleet architecture, which means logistics pressure and internal pressure, Iran must worry that Tehran itself could fall at any point. And Russia's global goals are facing yet other setbacks. Russia's Northern Sea route is reportedly in critical condition. Sanctions block the import of parts for dredging and for icebreaker maintenance. China has refused to invest, fearing secondary sanctions from the United States. Moscow admits it cannot guarantee cargo safety on one of its most important routes. But what do you see in the coming days? What do you see in the next week or two? Look specifically for the repetition across these corridors. Look what we see going on with the seizures. If there's more of them, if we see more corridors being challenged, this will be something that is a game changer for Russia, because they simply do not have a means of stopping it. But this continuous pressure right now that we see is very important. It's putting more and more stress on Russian logistics. Strikes on plants and depots have created a permanent condition of rear area insecurity. Signs of stress are visible in desperate redeployments and operational paranoia. Marinera is the physical proof that we've been looking for, the forensic evidence that a system is crumbling under synchronized pressure. The shadow fleet is now trackable, vulnerable, and physically breakable. Venezuela's bridge is dismantled and narrowing the workaround map to zero. Ukraine strikes deep and the opposition fractures. We see that Iran is being destabilized, and even the Arctic corridor is degrading, confirming that no route for Russia is any longer safe. But what's the most important here is that what we see going ahead, that Russia today tries to pretend that everything's okay. It tries to act like this is completely normal, that they expected this. This is totally within the realm of reason, but for them it is not. This is something that totally upsets their portfolio. There is no way that they can keep their grip when everything is happening at the same time. They can put out one fire, maybe two fires, but not fires across the globe. That's why Moscow today must attempt to restore deterrence optics without the capabilities to back them up. And that is exactly where we see the fatal gap. Today we see that Russia, it will try to project strength. It'll try to act like it is totally in control, that everything is fine, but increasingly it is not. We see that within the Kremlin, there are other problems. We see today that there is less trust amongst senior people. We see increasingly that the oligarchs are criticizing the government. Now, nobody criticizes Vladimir Putin personally. It's always been that way. You could talk badly about others, but not about the Tsar. But that criticism, we all understand who's the one making decisions that are destroying Russia today. And when they talk about each other, when they discuss what is going on, they all seem to think that things are coming to a head. And that's where there is such a problem for Putin. He is deluded, believing that Russia somehow can pull through. But at what point can Russia pull through? Where do you see Russia succeeding? It is still trying to take Pokrovsk. It has been trying to take Pokrovsk for more than 2 years. Now keep in mind, this town before the war had less than 60,000 people. And Russia, despite having 145 million people in their country, despite the fact they have one of the largest militaries in the world, cannot take a town of 60,000 people. That does not seem like a country that's winning. But look at its allies internationally. We see them falling. We look at their attempts to make money using things such as Shadow Fleet, and that's not working. We see that the price of oil today has reached such a low price that Russia cannot sustain its national budget with it. These gaps in its budget will cause there to be hunger in Russia. things are getting very, very bad for Vladimir Putin. But all the evidence shows that there's one thing that these things have in common. All these different incidences are part of the same story. And all of this is the story of how Vladimir Putin's fatal conceit will lead to his downfall. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.